I think I finally have this figured out now, so here it goes. So mocking the ability to provide. If you're wondering what the malevolent laughing at the end was, part of this story in the movie A200 is that there's an evil shaman that's sort of causing discord within the community, who eventually gets dispelled. And the people that did evil things, which is one of the men there and his sister, at the very end, they get forgiven, although they also get exiled from the community. So it's a very interesting story. So we should understand, as we're looking at that video, that there are two people that have extreme hostilities to each other that have built up over years, but then they attempt to stave off violence. The community sort of does a intervention, shall we say, by having them do a song duel. Unfortunately, the song duel isn't successful, so then they do have physical violence, although even still, the physical violence is highly culturally structured. It's not a free-for-all brawl. Instead, it's this very ritualized thing where the community is watching, where there are rules, and where they take turns hitting each other. So all of this is sort of designed to stave off any sort of unrestrained conflict, recognizing that there will be conflict, so therefore channeling the conflict. It's not as if these were insults were super nice or something, right? Those were kind of brutal. Insults clearly within that cultural context from that man to the other man. But it's better from this culture's perspective to do that than, again, to have true violence. And so it's a way potentially of dissipating it. And in many cases, although this one led to a fight, albeit a ritualized fight, in many cases, song duels result in sort of everybody laughing it off, right? We can kind of make joke of the conflict, bring up the ridiculousness of how different people acted, and sort of move on in a way, right? Whereas, which is really a kind of beneficial way of resolving a conflict. So why song duels then? First of all, nonviolent conflict resolution. It also reinforces community expectations, as the reading pointed out. When you hear people mock each other in these song duels, if you're, let's say, a young Inuit girl, let's say you're 10 years old, you're still kind of learning the rules of your community, and you're hearing the adults make fun of each other, you're getting a sense of what it is that you are or aren't supposed to do, because these joking songs are really serious, right? They're insulting the things that the other person has done that they see as inappropriate. You've stolen. You blame other people in that video, right? You blame other people for the fact that you've been unlucky in love. You are a jealous person. You're a vindictive person. As they are hurling these accusations at each other, everybody else in the community is getting a dose of kind of like, yeah, that's a pretty crappy way to be. I shouldn't be like that. It's reinforcing for the entire community, and especially the young people in the community, what you're not supposed to do by airing publicly these accusations. It's also, of course, a form of entertainment. Song duels are sort of entertaining for the other people around, presumably. Finally, depending on the song duel, so not really the one we just saw in the video, but for example, those more joking songs that are done, as they were talking about in some Canadian Inuit communities, these can, I would argue, just from what we see in other kinds of communities, that potentially these kinds of joking songs can reinforce relationships, although that might seem odd that making fun would reinforce a relationship. But I mean, think about it. You probably sometimes gently tease your friends in a way that other people don't get away with. And indeed, that's kind of a sign that you're really close friends. In Western Apache culture, there's a really great book about joking among Western Apache people. And one of the things they talk about in that book is that for Western Apache people, they often refer to friendships as like a piece of leather that kind of has to be slowly worked on so it gets flexible, because leather starts out all stiff. And you don't want to like work on it too fast or it just cracks, but it does need to be worked on over time and kind of made more flexible. And that's what joking does, is it kind of gets some gentle, good strain on the relationship to kind of test some boundaries and kind of get the relationship more flexible. It kind of breaks barriers, you could say. All right, well, let's now look at one of these song texts. And this one is actually specifically from one of those teasing cousin songs. And I want to emphasize that the teasing cousin songs in this are kind of a subset of the song duels, but they're kind of a much less serious version because they're not for cases of actual hostility, but between cousins who sometimes have kind of a joking, fun rivalry with each other. So I'm going to read this song. I'm not going to read the Inuit words, just the English words, but this is from the reading that you did. I was filled with confusion when a white man, Uri Yungi, asked me a question. It turned out to be because of Kimanak, Uri Yungi Ya. Now, as there's several other stories or songs like that that are shared in the reading, and as she points out, quote, from an outsider's perspective, Ugyavangmut Ulugit Atut, or Ugyavangmut is the name of her specific Inuit village and people from that village. Well, this village is now abandoned, but formerly from this village, and then Ilugit Atu, which means teasing cousin songs. So from an outsider's perspective, Ugyavangmut teasing cousin songs do not appear to be humorous, and an outsider would probably not understand their significance. And that's true, right? If you're not from that community, I don't think that joke kind of makes any sense. And even if you know the story behind it, so she explains the story behind it, which was basically that a helicopter pilot needed to come rescue a girl in the community. and fly her from the island to the mainland to get medical care, which is something obviously that happens in Alaska sometimes. And the helicopter pilot apparently hadn't been given good directions, so he landed on the south side of the island instead of the north side of the island. And so the guy that's composing the song, he is remembering that this white guy pilot was asking him questions about where the girl was because he was on the wrong side of the island because he hadn't gotten good directions from Kimenak. So Mayak is saying, like, Kimenak, if you hadn't given this guy such crappy directions, the helicopter guy wouldn't be on the south side of the island asking me where the girl was, instead he'd be on the north side. So it's making fun. It's also pointing out a pretty serious situation where, like, your stupidity or ineptitude caused, could have caused a bad situation if the pilot hadn't gotten there in time. But it's also meant to be funny. And yet, I think for most of us, even with that background story, it doesn't sound funny. It sounds actually really serious, and we don't really get the humor of it. And this brings up an interesting thing about jokes. All jokes are inside jokes, right? So we sometimes talk about like inside jokes that we have with our friends that only make sense to each other. But from an anthropological perspective, in a sense, all jokes are inside jokes. They're inside to that culture, to that community. Humor is obviously inherently subjective, and it's culture bound, meaning jokes that make sense in one culture don't make sense in another culture. As a good example of that, when I'm doing field work with my Navajo friends and colleagues and family members, they often make jokes that to me are funny because I've spent a lot of time around them, but I sometimes would try to explain to other people and don't make a lot of sense, like why they're funny. So for example, there's a lot of like play on words on people's names. And so it's sort of like somebody, will just kind of sit back and be like, oh, Adam, because that's my first name, Adam, first man, Adam, the man, and just kind of trail off. And that's funny when you're in those communities and you hear people like kind of pun on each other's names pretty often or kind of do silly like trail offs like that. But if you just repeat that to an outsider, like at a party or something, if I was to like bring that back to, let's say, my community here in Soldotna and say to a friend like, oh yeah, this joke, they'd probably be like, what? Why is that funny? And that's just how humor is. It's the same with this meme over here. So I love memes. You probably love memes too. And this one says, Banker, so you'd like a loan to start an all marsupial fighting championship? Me. Yes. I call it Mortal Wombat. Banker. Me. Banker. I'm in. This is very culture bound in several ways, right? For the first thing, you have to understand English to get any of this joke. Second off, you have to understand banking. Third off, you have to understand the video game, which was very popular in the 90s, Mortal Kombat, and also what a wombat is. And then you also have to understand kind of conventions of modern internet English speech, such as this thing where like you have somebody and a colon indicating that they're going to talk, but they don't talk, which basically is like a rough way of saying dramatic pause, I'm in. And now that I've explained it, the joke's not funny anymore, because jokes are based on kind of the gut punch of surprise. A lot of times they're based off our subverted expectations. We think something's going to go one way and it goes another. It zigs, then it zags. They're based on puns, which are another kind of subverted expectation, and they're based on exaggeration. So in this case, you're kind of subverting expectations in the sense that you think it's like, okay, why do you want to fight marsupials? And then he makes it into a pun on a video game, which was unexpected. And then it's unexpected that the banker would be like, okay, count me in. So that's oftentimes how humor works, which is one of the reasons why when you have to explain jokes, they're not funny, is because jokes are kind of a gut punch where you're expecting one thing and you get another, or something is unexpectedly exaggerated. But for any of that to work, it has to be rooted in expectations, and expectations are rooted in culture, right? You have to have some understanding of what's normal in a culture for jokes to make sense, because jokes so very often play on the abnormal. So that's an interesting aspect of joking behavior. Well, in any case, joking really is, in many cases, a form of social control. And when I say form of social control, I don't mean that your friends who joke with you are trying to control you, although maybe they are, and maybe if so, you should get new friends. But what I mean by that is that social control is always happening in a culture. It's not necessarily always a bad thing. When we have norms that say that, people shouldn't be mean to customer service people, and then we glare at people that are rude to customer service people, that's not a bad thing, right? Unless, well, that's another story for another day. But, or if we have sort of the norm that you're not supposed to cut people in line, and we glare at the people that cut people in line, that's not a bad thing. But we are exercising social control over each other. We're trying to influence the behavior of other people, and which to some degree is necessary for a culture to get along. some degree of social control. Now, jokes and teasing and mocking, especially in societies that lack is a strong word, I should say, which don't have things like a police force or a prison, which certainly traditionally in U.S. society did not prior to colonialism. Joking operates as a form of social control that's nonviolent but gets the point across, both directly and indirectly. Directly in the sense that you can directly be mocking somebody's behavior and kind of giving them the cue like, hey, we're just joking, but also you were kind of a jerk right then. And then also indirectly in the sense that people that are in the community that hear it are like, ha ha ha, that was a funny joke, but also I don't want to be a jerk. And we have lots of examples of this across cultures. So for example, in Western Apache culture, again, this great book by Keith Basso, Portraits of the White Man, he talks about these really kind of silly jokes that, this is like back in the 70s, that Western Apache people would like pretend to be their perception of white people, which was specifically the types of Euro-Americans that they were encountering in Arizona, which were like doctors and missionaries and salespeople. And so they'd be really exaggerated. It'd be like a doctor going up to like they'd pretend to be a white doctor and go up to their Apache friend and be like, hey man, hey, how you doing? You doing good? You doing good? Are you sick? Are you feeling well? How's your sex life? Here's some pills, right? It's like really obnoxious. That's not actually how most doctors sound, but it's hyperbole. And as Keith Basso points out, it serves a really serious purpose. It is funny for the people involved and people kind of get a giggle out of it, but it's also meant to prove a point, which is don't act like that, because that's not how Apache people act. We're not supposed to be overly friendly like that, where you kind of are jumping out of your seat to sell something to somebody, because they often perceive, at least they did at the time in the 70s, of Anglo-Arizonans as sort of like overly friendly, especially when they're trying to sell them something or give them something. And so from their perspective, this was sort of the joke kind of reinforces the message of like, we don't act like this as Apache people. That we don't think that's genuine and we don't act like that. Among Zuni and several other southwestern Native American tribes, you have clowns, which not like Bozo the Clown with the honky nose or something, but kind of similar in the sense of dancers who take part in these ceremonial dances where you have all these ceremonial deities, but then you also have these weird clown figures that are usually kind of painted very oddly, such as like black and white stripes with kind of funny things on their heads. And they often, in the midst of this really sacred ceremony, again, where you have masked deity figures and really sacred things being talked about, you also have these clowns that are doing absurd things like walking up a ladder backwards, or eating or pretending to eat feces, or just like ridiculous things. And as Barbara Tedlock points out in her book on Zuni clowning behavior and clowning behavior in general, they're meant to be funny, but they're also there to kind of reinforce ideas. They kind of teach us ideas, and they also kind of subvert expectations, and in doing so remind us that nothing's ever perfect, right? There's sort of the added bit of chaos to say that there's always going to be some chaos in life, and don't take yourself too seriously. Another example to show you that this is not restricted to North American indigenous peoples would be the San people, some of whom we refer to as Druhanzi, which is a famous hunter-gatherer group in southern Africa. And there's a funny little essay by a man who spent quite a bit of time there back in the 60s, I think it was, called Christmas in the Kalahari. And he talks about... Oh, I'm blanking on this guy's name right now, and it's really annoying me. But anyways, he talks about the fact that, he had been spending many months with these folks, interviewing them for his research project. He felt really grateful. He felt like they were really good friends, and so he wanted to do something nice for them, sort of as maybe his research was wrapping up. And so he bought a cow for slaughtering for the big Christmas feast, which Christmas is celebrated even though the people had not thoroughly Christianized. They called it the white man God's birthday, and then celebrated Christmas, at least nominally. And so he was going to buy them a big cow to slaughter for Christmas feast. And he thought he was doing a really nice thing, and he was excited about it as a nice present, a nice gesture. And then for like a month, because he bought it and they still had like a month before Christmas, people kept making fun of the cow and being like, "Oh man, Richard, that's the worst cow. Why did you buy us that cow? It's skin and bones. It is so thin. There's not going to be any meat on that. We'll be lucky if we can even get any meat off of it. We're going to be so hungry on Christmas. How could you do this to us?" And so they kept doing this and kept doing this and kept doing this. And then come Christmas, They slaughter the cow. Everybody has an amazing feast because it's a big old fat cow, and they all are super full and they love it and they're laughing and they're having a good party. And then he gets super pissed and he's like, what was the deal with you guys saying this was a skinny cow? You could see it was a fat cow. And then they all kind of burst into laughing, which of course makes him even angrier. And then they say, Richard, when people start to get too full of themselves, they said it a little differently than this, but they basically said when people start to get too full of themselves in our society, we have to kind of take them down a peg or two. And that's why we make fun of them like we did with you. And he reflects on his own behavior and he realizes, you know what? That's kind of true, right? I was trying to do a nice thing, but I was also kind of getting a bit of an ego trip out of it, right? Like, I'm the big generous guy going to help out this group, being so generous, I'm so cool. And instead, they took him down a peg or two by kind of making fun of him and making him doubt himself a little bit, which is really important in a society like the Zan, where you traditionally don't have a really clear hierarchy. There's a strong sense of egalitarianism, so it's really important that people not put themselves above each other. And, as a final example of sort of where people use jokes as a form of social control, I put memes. So again, memes are really funny, but they also oftentimes have a serious purpose in the sense that they reinforce proper social behavior, both in really big ways. Like I saw one today where it was like a billboard where two girls had put up a billboard to let their boyfriend know that they both found out about each other. So sometimes it's joking is this form of social control to talk about serious things like cheating, and sometimes really not serious things. So for example, in this meme, which is a text conversation that somebody screenshotted, their nephew is basically like, hey, how often do you clean your oven? And he's like, never. And he's like, really? I clean it every time. Why? Because the bottom gets full of bread and grease. On the baking sheet? He says, no, I don't have a baking sheet. I mean on the metal grills. And then he says, wait, I need a beer for this. You're putting the meat directly on the grill? Yep, I'm tweeting this. Right, so it's kind of this funny story where somebody was like really doing cooking the wrong way, putting the meat directly on the grill with directly in his oven without a baking sheet or anything underneath it. But it's also got kind of an effect of reminding us all that is not how you cook, and that's a stupid way to cook, right? And he's kind of, even with his comment, oh, quote unquote, I need a beer for this, he's kind of joking with his nephew and reminding him, like, that was dumb, don't ever do that again. Although I would say, hey, if nobody taught him, is it really dumb? I make all sorts of dumb mistakes in the kitchen, but it's a story for another day.